to be heard. God, hear my requests and answer me. The second one is the middle one, God's request to speak with us. Now that makes kind of sense, a little bit, because the psalmist says, Lord, hear me, and then God says, come talk to me. You want to hear me? Come talk to me. And then he says, my heart responds, Lord, I'm coming. But then verse 9 is kind of weird, and this is another clue that this is a balanced poem. He says, do not hide yourself from me. Now, if Kara had called me, like let's say I'm in the kitchen, and she hollers from the bedroom, and she says, Mikey, can you come in here? And I said, sure, I'll be there in a second, but please don't ignore me when I get there. She would think I was nuts. She already thinks I'm nuts. But, she would think I was a little extra nuts. Because if someone requests your attention, they're not going to ignore you immediately. They requested your attention for something. God says, come and speak to me. And the psalmist responds, don't abandon me. Why? Because it balances out verse 7, a plea to be heard. See how that works? 7 and 9 go together. Verse 8 is the center. You see, we're used to, our Greek thinking minds are used to linear thought processes where we begin with a first thought and build on it until we get to the point at the end. They don't do that. Their point is in the middle most times. Well, some of the time. I don't know where it lies, whether it's majority or not. But in this one at least, the point lies in the middle, okay? Now we'll come back to that in a minute. Let's move on. You can leave that up there. Let's go to verse 10. Even if my father and mother abandon me, the Lord will hold me close. So that is a response to verse 9, but it is also a parallel. Okay, it's a parallel. I'm not crying. I'm trying not to sneeze. It is a parallel of verses 5 and 6. Okay? Where God is going to conceal him. He's going to place him on a high rock. And then he says, the Lord will not abandon me in verse 10. You can see that here in the illustration where the statement of faith, God will never abandon me, is balanced with verses 5 and 6. Now verse 11 says, teach me how to live, O Lord. Lead me along the path of honesty, for my enemies are waiting for me to fall. Do not let me fall into their hands, for they accuse me of things I've never done and breathe out violence against me. So here we see the parallel or the balancing of the first request, which is intimacy with God. You remember what the psalmist was doing in the temple? Meditating in the temple and delighting in God's perfections. Do you know what? Well, I'll just tell you. In ancient Hebrew, God's perfections was oftentimes a slang term for the law, because the law was considered the perfect image of God. Okay? So we see here that the knowledge of God's ways, verse 11 and 12, he says, teach me how to live. Well, how does God teach you how to live? Verse 4, living in the temple of the Lord and meditating in his temple and delighting in his perfections. You see how this works? See, you could read that and get something out of it. But when you understand the parallel, now you understand that he's not just saying, just teach me in a vacuum. He's saying, teach me as I meditate in your temple. In other words, if you're lacking wisdom from the Lord, if you need something, don't stand outside the temple. Get inside, answer his call to come speak to him. Speak to him, let him speak to you, and then meditate in the temple, delight in his perfections, develop an intimate relationship with him, and then verse 11, he'll teach you how to live. So you can understand it better when you understand the structure of the poem. Now I think it's interesting. Look at what he says. Verse 11, teach me how to live, O Lord. Lead me along paths of honesty. For, there's the word for again. Change it with because my enemies are waiting for me to fall. Isn't that interesting? Teach me your ways because my enemies are waiting for me to fall. You ever had somebody wait for you to fall? You ever experienced that before? Where someone doesn't like you and you know they're just waiting for you to mess up? It happened to me in the workplace once. It wasn't a career job, so, but there was an individual there that was just kind of waiting for me to screw up so that he could get my job. And doesn't that just irritate you? Like, you know what? I got this job. You just back off and leave me alone. Well, you know what happened? I fell. I messed up. I didn't lose the job, but He was waiting for me to fall, and because I didn't know God the way I should at the time, I was a teenager, I ended up messing up and fulfilling my enemy's purpose for me, waiting for me to fall. So when we know God's ways, our enemies can wait all they want, but we're not going to fall. Now look at verse 13. Verse 13, I want to point out something. You'll notice here that verse 13 is in blue, and then, I didn't label verse 14, but the final part there is in black. Notice that it is not balanced with anything. That is unusual, but it's not totally uncommon. It does happen. It's not the only instance, but it is not part of the balanced poem. I'll show you why in a minute. So verse 13 says this, "Yet I am confident that I will see the Lord's goodness while I am here in the land of the living." The psalmist says, look, my enemies are waiting for me to fall. I need to learn from the Lord His ways. But I know I'm going to see the Lord's goodness in the land of the living. It balances out, number one. God watches out for me. He protects me. Why do I need to be afraid? Because I know I'm going to see His goodness while I'm still alive. It's a great promise from God. Now, before we get to verse 14, I want to go back to verse 8. That's the center of the poem. My heart has heard you say, come and talk with me, and my heart responds, Lord, I am coming. Why do I think that's the center of the poem? Well, first of all, it's the only request that God makes. You notice that? All these other requests are the psalmist's requests to God. And then all of a sudden, in verse 8, God's talking, and He only talks for one verse. He says a few words, and then He's done. So it stands out in the poem. It is also somewhat in the middle of the poem, lengthwise, and it is in the middle of three requests. It is the center request. I guess I could do it like that. It's a better illustration. This is how most people do three. I do it like that because I'm weird. Who said, uh-huh? Who said that? Cheryl did? Okay. That's the middle of the poem. In other words, that's the point. You know, there's some great stuff in this poem. Why do I need to be afraid? God is my protector. I want to live in the house of the Lord. That's actually been made into several songs. My greatest desire to live in the house of the Lord, and meditate in His temple, and delight in His goodness. Lots of great stuff in here. Why is number 8 the center? Why is it the most important? Because you can't have any of the rest of it without having number 8. You can't have any of the rest of it without number 8. Yes, God is your protector. If that's the truth, why are Christians suffering? Could it be because we're not close enough to God? Or there are other reasons, yes. But that is one example. I know a fella, I can't tell you his name, but he's suffering right now, relationally. And one of the reasons is he has decided in his heart to chase after something other than God. He believes in God, and I believe he's saved. But God has said, come and talk to me, and he said no. He said, I would rather do this instead. And what he's doing isn't sinful. I want to mention that the other thing he's chasing is not a sin in itself. But he has decided, I'm going to do something else. I'm not going to sit in God's temple. I'm not going to meditate in His temple and delight myself in His perfections. I'm going to do this other thing. In other words, in verse 8, God says, or his heart has heard God say, come and talk with me, and he said, I'm too busy. And his life is not protected. And he's struggling. Now, like I said, there are other reasons for struggle. But I'd say, at least in America, that's probably the number one reason why. So God's protection. If you know you don't have God's protection, there's reason to fear. Because this world is filled with terrible things and terrible people. There's all kinds of opportunities for us to hurt. And sometimes we don't even know why. We don't even know what's wrong. We just know that we're unhappy. And we can't figure it out. And we struggle and we fight and we try all kinds of things to make it better. And that's the unknown. Think about all the things that are out there that you know about that can make you suffer. We need God's protection in our lives. Without it, we just disappear. We need to make sure that when God says, come and talk with me, that we respond, Lord, I am coming. I know a young lady who is in a, what do you call that, a relationship issue. She likes some guy that, to put it nicely, is not paying close enough attention. And it came out in conversation with somebody else that she's interested in him in more than just friends. And he didn't respond the way she hoped. She's pretty hurt. Heck, I'm hurt. He's a good guy. I love this guy. I'd take him in a heartbeat, you know. Not as my husband, obviously, but you know what I'm talking about. Just wanted to clarify. Those of you that are asleep going, what? Micah said his husband? What? And you know, I had a long chat with her not too long ago. And just, you know, and the pain and the heartache and the questions and, you know, just, I praise God I didn't have to do any of that. I met Carol when I was 15 and we never broke up. So, yes, I never had to deal with that. But, you know, there's few things sadder than unrequited love. And God woos us like a spouse, or better yet, a fiancé. He says, come, be with me. Spend time with me. I mean, really, is that other stuff you're doing so interesting that you can't spend time with me? Those of you who are married, you've all experienced the moment where you wanted to share something with your spouse and they were more interested in something that you didn't understand. Like, for example, when Kara says, can we talk? And I'm playing a computer game. Honey, I'm just about to level up here. Can you just give me like 15 minutes? Yes, I'm that nerdy. And you know, I've stopped doing that for the most part. Because I see the look on her face. When she says, come and be with me, and I say, I'm too busy doing something else, what am I telling her? This thing's more important than you. When God comes to us and says, please talk with me and say, I'm sorry, I've got to go to work. I'm sorry, I've got to talk to my friends. I'm sorry, I've got to have some time to relax. God says, okay, I guess that's more important than me. And we never want to look at it that way. You know, we have our excuses. We say, no, God, I'll be there soon. And you got to understand, God isn't the kind of God who's going to get up there and go, fine. You know, that's not Him. He understands. He knows we're weak. He knows we're grass and we disappear with the wind. He knows that. But when we understand it from a human perspective, we can perhaps see it from His eyes a little better. Just because it doesn't destroy Him doesn't mean it doesn't hurt Him. And when we put something else ahead of Him, whether it be our spouse, or our kids, or our bank accounts, or heaven forbid, our fields, or our, I don't know, I can only think of stuff that's interesting to me. Fields aren't that interesting to me, or paintball, or whatever. You know, when we, computer, yeah, but I've already said that one. I wanted to come